Okay, so can anyone tell me what the general refrain people say about Hypoxylon is? What's the going wisdom?
Hypoxylon killed oak.
Yeah, so that's one thing. We laugh at people that say Hypoxylon killed a tree, right? More or less, or we don't laugh at them, but we see that as maybe like a
Bit of an overstatement.
bit of an overstatement. That's kind of like the going wisdom. Anything else?
Sapwood.
Sapwood, it's a weak pathogen. So those are, I want to perhaps provide you with some additional information to get you to respect it more. I want you to be able to think about it when you come across it in a tree in some key ways that maybe you haven't been thinking about it. And then to understand its very interesting disease cycle. That's sort of the goal of this presentation. And hopefully I don't have to explain this to you. We'll come back to it and see if you get my gist. This is Drew Barrymore from The Scream, by the way. It's kind of a stereotype in horror movies where you're like worried about the killer like being outside of where you are, and then it turns out, like they've been in there the whole time. Yeah, which is the case in The Scream. So yeah, you get a scary phone call, he's like, I'm coming for you, and then you realize the guy's already like gotten past all your home defenses and they're inside. All right, anyways. So I want to define a term really quick, like what is an endophyte? Maybe you've heard the term epiphyte. It describes like lichens, mosses, things that grow on other things. So what is an endophytic organism? It's something that, simply put, lives inside something else. Bacteria can do it, fungi can do it. And it doesn't necessarily indicate whether that's good or bad. There is endosymbiosis, which is like a good pairing that occurs intracellularly. Certain types of mycorrhizae are endosymbiotic because they're actually inserting themselves into like the root tips. And Hypoxylon is an endophyte, and we'll get into what that means. So Hypoxylon is an old taxonomic designation for a genus. It has been renamed, and this is looking at that, it's a really intimidating word, but it's Biscogniauxia. The full binomial Biscogniauxia Atropunctata, and there are several different organisms that are called Hypoxylon. Some of them are fairly distantly related, and we have multiple organisms in this area that could brightly be called Hypoxylon. But the main one that you're going to be seeing on a lot of hardwoods and oaks primarily is going to be this Biscogniauxia Atropunctata. Now on sycamores, there's another species, Camellia tinctor, that is going to be a little bit more common. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're more or less going to be treating them all equally, although this is the main one. Please don't even try to remember this. I just find it interesting. So Hypoxylon is kind of concentrated in the eastern United States, specifically in the southeast. I never once saw this like out west until I came here. So this is something that we are dealing with. The other parts of the US are not. I already covered this. So interestingly, Hypoxylon's in the same family as like dead man's fingers, if you've heard of those. They're these like creepy little gray black fungi that can kind of pop out of the soil and almost look like, as the name suggests, dead man's fingers. Kretschmeria is also closely related to Hypoxylon. There's another of other kind of black crusty fungi that are also in this family. And then in the order, more broadly speaking, so if you think about, I think kings play chess on funny green squares. That's sort of the taxonomic rankings. Family, so species, genus, family, and then order is the next one up. So in the Xylariales order, there are a few other crusty black fungi that are easy to misidentify as this Atropunctata, but are distantly related. There's not a lot of information about like what their mechanism is, like if they might be parasites and killing live tissue, or if they're purely saprobic. Again, saprobic meaning they're just decaying material that's already non-functional. It's already dead. All right, so Hypoxylon, it causes a white rot. So that is going to be decaying both lignin and cellulose. It can cause limb death and crown dieback. And it produces zone lines. So as you're cutting through wood, it's sort of these exact pieces are what is the background of this slide. I don't know if these zone lines in these particular cutouts were caused by, you pass those around, were caused by Hypoxylon. I think there's a good chance though. And it's essentially hardened mycelium within the wood that mixes with the wood itself and is pigmented. And it's essentially the mushrooms. You know, like when you're playing Uno and your brother or your siblings like trying to peek over at your cards, so you like hold them close to your chest. That's essentially what this is. It's the fungus sort of staking out its little spot for the lunch it's digesting, referring to Julius's poem, The Languid Lignin Lunch. So it's setting up its own boundaries within an organism that sets up boundaries, right? A tree sets up, like that's what coated is essentially, you know, the tree setting up specific boundaries. So an interesting analog. But what actually are those zone lines? They're not lines, they're plates. We call them pseudosclerotial plates. That's kind of like the fancier way to refer to it. And just in the same way that a growth increment looks like a ring in cross section, but is actually kind of like a new sock that's on the tree, right? Have you thought about that before? Like what a growth increment actually is in terms of the tree. We see it as a ring because we cut laterally through a tree or horizontally through a tree, but that is it's a new tree on top of the old tree, like a really thin one, but it's like putting a sock over your foot and putting another sock over that sock. So I actually have like a cross section of these zone lines, what they look like, you know, sort of not cut horizontally. So take a look at the edges and you'll notice how thin this layer is. But these are those pseudosclerotial plates, or simply put, zone lines. So Hypoxylon causes these, Kretschmeria also causes them. I'm pretty sure I've seen stumps with really aggressive plates where the wood has started coming off and you see some interior layers exposed. You'll come across these like thin, hard layers that are almost like slick to the touch. Those are produced by these decay fungi. A number of other organisms will produce them, but Kretschmeria notably does as well. All right, so the disease cycle of Hypoxylon. Hypoxylon is really widespread in this environment, and so the spores are everywhere. And as these spores land on a tree, if they find a natural opening in the tree or like a pruning cut, the spores land on these vulnerable areas, they germinate, and they start to put their versions of like roots or hyphae like into the tree, where they're going to remain dormant for a long period of time until conditions are right for them to start spreading. And they'll form actually like colonies in the inner bark and the sapwood, and they just hang out waiting for their moment. So what are the types of events then that might precipitate this sudden like expansion where they then become parasitic, or where they actually start working on the wood of the tree? There are a number of things that can cause this. Most of it comes down to decreasing the moisture content of the wood around this colony. So I've got a number of inciting potential incidents here, but I want to quickly talk through why each of these individually might decrease the moisture content of the wood. So defoliation by fungi, and I mean more like the fungi, the spots that you see on leaves, these like foliar pathogens that might cause like early leaf drop, or insects. So oakworm or orange-striped oakworm, I believe it's called, is a common one that can defoliate like an entire oak. Why do you think that might reduce the moisture content of like a limb or a trunk? What are your thoughts? Lean into what you know about tree biology here.
Lack of transpiration.
Lack of transpiration. Thank you, David. Yeah. So what pulls water up through the tree? Or what's one of the main mechanisms by which water is transported through the tree? Transpiration. And so what is that actually doing though?
It's creating a negative pressure that, along with the capillary action, just keeps water flowing.
So define transpiration for me real quick.
Is the evaporation basically off the underside of leaves,
yeah,
through the stomata, that creates the effect that I just mentioned.
Yeah, so to reiterate what Michael said, transpiration is the evaporation of water from the undersides of leaves. And so as water is leaving the tree, because water coheres to itself, meaning it's like sticky, it wants to remain like touching itself, it draws water up through these tubes, these tracheal vessels, the vessels, tracheids, etc., and that's what creates this kind of continuous column of water in the tree. So if you lose your leaves, you lose the transpiration, that moisture content is going to drop. So saturated soil, why might that reduce transpiration or the water content of wood. It's a lot of water, right? So why would that reduce the moisture content? What was that?
Is it choking out the roots?
Yeah, so it's choking out the roots. And what do you mean? Draw that out a little bit for me.
They're too saturated to actually like have any water exchange between the roots and the soil.
Yeah, so I think of like water everywhere and not a drop to drink, right? Like we're creating hypoxic or anaerobic conditions where it's really difficult. There's just too much water. So fill dirt and compaction, essentially like anything that's disrupting the roots. This should be a little bit more obvious, but what do you guys think? Where do roots play in the absorption of, well, I just said it, but what, yeah, so losing topsoil, construction damage, and especially in the form of compaction or cut roots. How might compaction affect?
Crush the fine root hairs.
Crush the fine root hairs. And then also, what do you need in soil for water?
Pore space.
Pore space, yeah. So compaction is ruining the soil texture or the soil architecture. So drought, heat, those are a little bit more obvious. How about overcrowding? How might that reduce the available moisture of a tree? Yeah, competition. So in these, where people have like a new home built, actually no, I'm gonna keep this rolling. All right, so once that moisture level drops, at that point, and that could be due to a number of inciting incidents as we've just discussed, these little benign, what have been up to this point, benign endophytic little colonies, they start to rapidly expand. It can happen months after a serious drought event. Or oftentimes the following years when we'll start to see the damage show up. And it starts to decay the inner bark and sapwood. And we're gonna come back to this word stromata in another slide, so go on. And then, so once the fungus has been at work in the tree for a while, it forms a fertile surface. That's gonna be like what you see in the form of like this sort of elbow patch on the tree. And then from that fertile surface, which is what it is, it's where the spores or the mechanism of distribution, these little structures called perithecium or conidiophores are being produced that just spew like millions, if not billions of spores into the environment to repeat the same cycle. They get blown off. A certain number of these are gonna land on spots where they're able to germinate and the whole cycle starts again. Most of the trees we work on probably have some dormant Hypoxylon hyphae spore colonies like in the wood. It's just really, really common. All right, so I want to speak a little bit to this idea that it's not really involved in tree death or that it's a really weak parasite. I'm just going to read this because I feel like it's a really great or a really informative passage from the landscape, this book here, this book. The Diseases of Trees and Shrubs. We have a copy in the office. It's a really phenomenal resource. It's a really fun. Look up something that you feel like you understand. Like I recommend go open that book, find the page on Kretschmeria, and just read the whole page. It's got really phenomenal information. But Biscogniauxia species are often called weak pathogens because they cause severe damage only to drought-stressed or otherwise predisposed trees. This assessment understates their role in tree health, however. They are secondary in the temporal sequence of stressing factors, but may, along with so-called secondary insects, be direct causes of dieback or tree death. So this is a little bit different than what we typically hear arborists say on the topic. And I just want you to respect what this organism is doing because of its widespread prevalence. And it's a unique thing to the eastern United States too. So we as arborists in this region, this is something I feel like we should know a little bit more about. So let's parse this out a little bit because some of the language might be a little confusing. They are secondary in the temporal sequence. So temporal, so it's not going to be like the first thing. So it's talking about within the sequence of time, it's maybe not the first thing that happens to the tree that starts the tree down its mortality spiral. Is this a term you guys have heard before? Like how do trees die? Is it typically, there are certain things, oftentimes there are these like invasive pathogens or insects that have been introduced from other parts of the world, like chestnut blight or emerald ash borer, more pertinently to us now, where you can have a single organism that can like take out a healthy tree, and it is pretty much like solely responsible. That's typically not the case for what's going to happen with especially oaks. It's going to be a chorus. there's going to be a predisposing incident, something stronger gets into the tree that's able to get past the tree's strong defenses. It starts the work of working in the trees, and then all of this cascade of events happens to take the tree down. Ambrosia beetle is another good example of something that's going to require a stress tree, but then sort of delivers the coup de grace, the final blow that takes the tree out. But you can't necessarily say that the ambrosia beetle was solely responsible, because it's coming in after a lot of that work has already been done. All right, so I also want you to know Hypoxylon canker has 3 distinct stages, and you've probably seen it and not realized what you were looking at before. So on the left, within its life cycle, as it first starts producing spores, it's producing, don't worry too much about this, it's producing asexual spores, essentially like clones of itself. In this stage, it has like a khaki brown appearance, and if you were to go up and like blow on one of these patches, you're going to see a dust like pop up. So that coloration is from like the spores on the surface. So that is this stage here. This is its earliest stage. So what happens is as the spores, as the colony starts to expand, there's pressure that's exerted between the sapwood and the bark, like as this is growing, the stroma, that's fertile surface that's producing spores, and that pressure eventually, as the inner bark dies, it causes the bark to slough off, revealing this canker. So there's a little bit of disagreement in the sources that I use to prepare for the order of the following 2 stages. I think most of you are probably familiar with it when it's a slick black surface. And so in this picture on the right, this is the sexual stage. So it's spewing spores out from these little structures called parathecium. Don't remember that. But they are, a closer look at it, as you can see, there's kind of like a white background and these gray dots. And these gray dots are the structures that are pushing out these spores. And then there's a little bit of disagreement about this, but according to the Landscape or the Diseases of Shrubs and Trees book, which I think has the best research of all of my sources, so I'm kind of leaning in this sequencing of events, eventually it will turn completely black. And that's when it's at its most mature stage. So yeah, know to recognize this. And we're going to talk about why it's important for you to recognize this in a moment. So
Same from a climbing perspective?
we're getting to it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I would say, from experience, I would say gray, watch out, black, really bad. So I would agree.
Yeah, yeah, and this happens relatively quickly too. It's a rapid, it decays quickly, and its life cycle occurs within, according to the material I read, it happens over 3 to 4 months that it should be going through like each of these stages. And then this black stage is what's going to remain. So you can see a little bit of both of those in this photo here. So a stroma, that's the word, like a mushroom is what we call the fruiting body of, like most mycelium that we're going to encounter. So like this would be a mushroom. You guys So stroma, what is it actually? It's just like a mat of hardened mycelium that is the support structure for the reproductive structures. So we've already covered this. So these cankers can be quite long. They can be up to 4 feet in length. They can be quite small as well, up to 9 inches wide. We've covered the tan, dusty. So the stroma, the fertile surface, when it's tan, that's its earliest state. Silver with black dots, it's the next phase, the reproductive state. When it's black, that's the mature. And so again, like I said, there are lookalikes. Just realize when you're saying like, oh, this is hypoxylon, that could mean a few different things. And it could mean some things that are actually like fairly distantly related to what all of us are mainly referring to when we say hypoxylon. Again, Biscogniauxia Atropunctata. Don't need to remember that. You're fine just to keep saying hypoxylon. All right, so last slide. Trees and tree parts with hypoxylon should be treated with caution. There are things that are very likely to break under your weight. These are branches, like if you are specced for a tree to do some like end weight reduction, but you come across a branch with hypoxylon and there's a target below it, you should just take that out. If it's going to be a really big deal to get it out, maybe have a conversation with the client about it. But typically, I would expect you, even if I haven't told you to do this, if you come across branches with hypoxylon, just remove them. And you will see trees with hypoxylon on the trunk. Now, these are isolated colonies. Just because you see it on one part of the tree, you can't assume that it's systemic. There are a lot of reasons why portions of the tree might be experiencing that reduced water drop. For example, removing a large limb. Shigo talks a lot about this. Oftentimes following a large limb removal, there will be a strip of dead tissue that forms below that removed branch. And so you might see hypoxylon start to cultivate that. It doesn't necessarily mean like the tree is a goner. It could just be sort of colonizing this particular strip of dead wood. So there's a little bit of judgment and sort of application of biological principles that would ideally be done in making an assessment of what the appearance of hypoxylon means. But in general, if you're seeing it in multiple parts of the tree, multiple branches, and it's a tree that's not being removed, it may mean that we need to revisit what the plan of management for this tree is. And I actually had, that I want to talk about really briefly, an experience with this. I'd been watching an oak. I came in, I looked at an oak in the summer, and there were there's some crown dieback. I was seeing some dead branch tips, and it was a consequential oak relative to the home. And I didn't feel like I had enough information to make a confident assessment of what was going on. And so I offered him the option to have a level 3 risk assessment, meaning getting me like up in the canopy to take a closer look around. And it was once I got up into the canopy that I started noticing Hypoxylon cankers not only on several large branches, but also like on the trunk itself. And that went from a let's wait and see what happens to let's get this tree removed. And Alex actually removed that tree. Alex and Lee, and who else was on that job? It was under bid, I remember that. Sorry, Alex. I think it was a frustrating removal for you. Is Alex here? Yeah, you were cussing like way out on a limb. Like I hadn't adequately thought out like how much room we had. Yeah, you did a great job. It was, and I think, and I apologize. I think that tree may have been a little bit more hazardous than what I had realized. I know better now. Yeah, thank you for risking your life for me. I appreciate it.
You don't have to be worried when Alex stops cussing.
Yeah, it's not treatable. There's nothing you can do about it. And drought is the major precipitating event, and it can spread rapidly. So if you're curious, if you're like, this is bullshit, I've heard plenty of people say that is not an issue. Each of these 3 sources, you can get this link. I've sent a copy of this presentation to Amanda, or you can ask me. One last point I'll make in this like overly long presentation is that if you are unaware, if you don't know what your tools are to educate yourself on some of these topics, whether it's tree biology, how to figure things out on your own, that is a skill that you have to develop. And if you want to learn how to do that better, you can talk to me, you can talk to Michael, you can talk to Craig. A lot of times it comes down to knowing where to turn to. Like what are good resources versus like questionable or bad resources. So if you're curious about this, if you want to be able to suss some of this out for yourself, it's a great skill to develop, especially if you ever want to get more into the consulting side of things and you're oftentimes seeing stuff and you don't know what it is right away. I'd love to have these conversations with you. And then just as a point of seasonal interest, I was out on a hike with Michael yesterday, and I came across this lovely little mushroom that at first glance looks like just a normal oyster, but if you take a close look, it has this really beautiful sort of rosy, almost purplish hue, and that's especially like visible on the underside. I found it growing at the base of a tree from the ground. It wasn't like growing from wood. This is a bluet, which is actually edible. I'm pretty sure it occurs across all of North America, and I've seen a handful of them now. So this is something that you might come across. And that is it. Thanks, guys. Yeah, questions? Chase.
I've been, hopefully you can help me refine this or persuade me to stop using this, but I found myself using a simile with homeowners when talking about hypoxylon, that I liken it to Staphylococcus with humans. That more often than not, it lives presently dormant in a lot of us or all around us and requires like the X number of variables to come into play before it runs rampant. Would that be a fair way to kind of use an alternative example to engage like a homeowner when describing this thing?
As long as they know what Staphylococcus is, or you'd find, I don't know what Staphylococcus is. Well, what is Staphylococcus? I know I've heard that word before, but staph infection.
Yeah.
Yeah, that, again, a simile, it's really going to depend on the person you're talking to, how effective that is, but what you have described sounds like a very good metaphor to me. Yeah. We didn't come back to this, and Justin, I'll get to you next. So that first slide, the call is coming from inside the house. Now, does anyone have an idea of what I may have been referring to? Is that obvious? All right, so for the sake of me, like, spell it out. It's already there, yeah. It's in the tree. It's not something that infects the tree and then starts. Like, it's been there, man, potentially for like a decade or two. You're not safe. It's in your house.
It's all safe.
All right, Justin.
You said the life cycle is pretty short, like 3 months.
Yeah, relatively speaking, 3 to 4 months.
Do you see this as a seasonal thing?
I mean, yeah, because drought is seasonal, like heat stress. Again, with that being the major precipitating event, then yeah, I would imagine that we're seeing more of this start to occur like during the hotter, drier months of summer. But I'm sure it's occurring throughout the year. It's going to depend on, and there's a lot that I don't know here. Like, does temperature affect the ability of the fungus to spread? You know, we're probably obviously seeing some reduced moisture content of wood during the winter, but I don't think we're necessarily seeing like trees blow up with hypoxylon during that period. So I would suspect so, but there could be things that I don't know. So, any other questions? Greg?
Because it's always tends to be already present, can we say to homeowners, there's no need to remove this dying oak to prevent the spores from...
Yeah, so Craig's question was, since it's a disease that's highly prevalent, go take a walk in the woods and just start looking for it. Now that you've seen photos of these 3 stages, I suspect that you'll start to see it like everywhere. I certainly do. And so if you imagine, each one of these patches is producing millions of spores. Those spores can travel miles. They're insanely light, microscopic. They weigh almost nothing. They float on the wind. They're everywhere. So back to Craig's question, if they have, you know, we've told them leave a habitat snag, and now it's like covered head to base to tip with Hypoxylon Canker. Is that dramatically increasing the risk to their trees? Arguably, like, there are more spores. Like, I don't think we can really honestly say that there aren't more spores for this, but it's just like, if you add a drop to the ocean, like, does the ocean increase in size? Like conceptually, like, yes, but like functionally, pragmatically, like, no. Like, it's not going to make a difference. However, within a tree, I do think we should treat it as best practice because these colonies do spread, and because they are localized, if you come across a branch with it, it should be your automatic predisposition to remove that no matter what the pruning specs are. Unless it's going to dramatically change the time it takes to do your job, have a conversation with the client about it. Any other questions? Michael?
You mentioned that flooding conditions also reduce moisture in the tree, and I wondered if you had a clear understanding of like how that functionally works. Is it that there's so much water in the soil that the counter pressure of water tension is actually holding the water down, or like why does that decrease? I don't
have like a cogent, immediate, succinct answer for that. I do know so that like trees that exist in frequently or constantly hypoxic or anaerobic soil environments, so like swamps, marshlands, lowlands, they have really specific biological adaptations, even specific types of, do you guys know the word parenchyma? It's like a type of cell within the tree. They have specific types of parenchyma cells even to be able to adapt to these low oxygen environments. So I don't, unfortunately, I wish I had thought to have a better answer for that prepared, but does anyone else? Craig?
Well, I got a thing like that I think of when I try to explain to someone is,
Yeah.
you know, if you take like a trash pump, right, you're pumping from one pool to another, well, they're both equally filled, all of a sudden that pump starts to decrease. Whereas when one's empty, it's easy for it to pump right through to it.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Because like you said earlier, it's that negative pressure or whatever.
Yeah.
This is probably a terrible analogy, but I also wonder if, so if you think about, if you take like a Gatorade bottle, or what's going to be the best? So if you're with water bottles, there's like the portion that you drink in, and then often there's another hole to like let air in, and that helps to like. Do you know the principle I'm talking about? Yeah. There may be something like that involved as well, but I'm not sure. That's a great question though, and I'll look into that and have a better answer.
So I think it has to do with respiration. So
Yeah.
to respire, they need available oxygen, and available oxygen is not in water. And when they stop respiring, they have dysfunction. So it's like the root is no longer working anymore, so they can't do it. That's my understanding.
Okay, so to reiterate what Craig just said, plants need oxygen to function, or roots need oxygen to function, and in the absence of oxygen, a lot of these biological processes break down or stop. And so the roots are no longer functioning as they optimally would be. Again, there are trees, there are plants that are adapted to this way that have found ways around this, but so. And I've never seen Hypoxylon on bald cypress. Well, I don't know that it occurs actually on gymnosperms. I think it's primarily hardwoods to begin with, so yeah, scratch it.
Point stand.
Yeah, Tupelo, swamp Tupelo, I'm pretty sure I have seen it on above portions on dead trees.